He grabbed her collar in front of everyone. 390 soldiers stood frozen as Drill Sergeant Marcus Whitaker's fist closed around the fabric at Emily Carter's throat, and she did not move, did not flinch, did not look away. If you believe one person can change an entire institution, stay with me until the end, and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. The hand that grabbed her collar had killed men in 3 wars. That was the first thing Emily Carter thought when she felt the fabric at her throat go taut. Not fear, not panic. Just that single clarifying fact: the hand wrapped around her collar belonged to a man who had survived things most people could not imagine, and he was using it right now to try to make her feel small in front of 390 people who were holding their breath, waiting to see if she would break. She did not break. She stood exactly where she was, feet at shoulder width, spine straight, chin level, and she looked Drill Sergeant Marcus Whitaker directly in the eyes. How is 6 feet 2 inches of decorated military career, 23 years of service, 2 silver stars, a combat infantryman badge, a chest that looked like a military museum exhibit. The kind of man who walked into a room and made other men instinctively straighten their posture. The kind of authority that entire institutions had been built around protecting. And right now, he was gripping her collar because she had asked him a question he did not want to answer. "You think this is funny, Carter?" His voice was not loud. That was the thing that always surprised people who had never been in his formation before. Marcus Whitaker did not need volume. His voice came out low and controlled and precise, the way a blade comes out of a sheath, quiet, certain, and designed to cut. "No, Drill Sergeant. You think you can stand in my formation and question my judgment in front of my soldiers? I asked a question about the regulation, Drill Sergeant. I did not question your judgment." The fabric at her throat pulled tighter. Around them, 390 recruits did not move. Some of them had been standing in that formation for 40 minutes already. Their legs ached. Their arms ached. The summer heat pressed down on all of them like something physical and heavy. But not one of them shifted. Not one of them looked away. Because something was happening in front of them that none of them had words for, yet something that felt like it was bigger than one recruit and one drill sergeant. Something that felt like it was going to matter for a long time after this morning ended. Emily Carter felt the eyes on her back like heat. She also felt something else. She felt the small spiral notebook in the left breast pocket of her uniform pressed against her chest, just beneath the hand that was grabbing her collar. 14 weeks of dates and times and exact words recorded in handwriting so small and careful that it looked like code. 14 weeks of documentation collected with the patience and precision of someone who had understood from the very beginning that the truth was not going to protect her unless she could prove it. She had known this moment was coming. She had not known it would feel exactly like this: the weight of his grip, the silence of 390 people, the strange clarifying calm that had settled over her, like she had stepped out of the noise into somewhere very quiet. Her father's voice came back to her the way it always did when things got difficult. "Baby emotion is honest, but evidence is permanent." She breathed. She did not pull away from his grip. She waited. Teteg. Emily Carter had not come to Fort Campbell to become anyone's cautionary tale. She arrived on a Tuesday in early June, carrying a duffel bag and a photograph folded twice and tucked into the inside pocket of her jacket. The photograph was of her brother Michael, taken 3 years before he died. In it, he was 26 years old and grinning like he knew something the camera didn't, wearing his uniform with the easy comfort of someone who had grown into it rather than put it on. Michael Carter had been an Army Ranger. He had done 2 deployments and come home from both of them. The third deployment was the one that didn't work out the way anyone planned. Before he left for that third tour, he and Emily sat on the back porch of their parents' house in Clarksville, Tennessee, and he told her something she wrote down afterward because she did not want to forget it. "People think the military is about being the hardest, meanest person in the room," he said. "But the soldiers I respect most, the ones who actually keep people alive when things go wrong, they're the ones who know how to be steady. Not hard, steady. There's a difference." Emily had thought about that word steady every single day since she arrived at Fort Campbell. She thought about it during the first week when the physical training nearly destroyed her, and she went to sleep every night with her muscles shaking and her pride held together with nothing but stubbornness. She thought about it during the second week when she started noticing the way Sergeant Whitaker moved through the formation during drills, the way his attention was not distributed evenly, the way it gathered and focused on certain recruits like a spotlight that never quite turned off. She thought about it during the third week when a recruit named Jason Miller came back from a one-on-one correction session with Whitaker and sat down on the edge of his bunk and stared at the floor for 20 minutes without saying anything. Emily sat down next to him. What happened? Jason was 22 years old from rural Alabama, built like someone who had been doing physical labor since he was 12. He was not a soft person. He did not scare easily. But when he looked at Emily, something in his face was wrong. He told me I was taking the spot of someone who actually deserved it, Jason said. Emily looked at him for a moment. He said that exactly, in those words, close enough. Did anyone else hear it? Jason shook his head. Just me and him. Emily went back to her bunk and opened her notebook. She wrote down the date, the time, Jason's name, and exactly what he had told her. Then she sat and thought for a long time about the difference between a hard person and a steady one, and about what her brother had meant when he said that steady was the thing that actually kept people alive. By the end of the first month, she had documented 11 separate incidents. Not dramatic confrontations. Nothing that would make headlines on its own. A correction that crossed the line from professional to personal. A comment delivered in front of the formation that was technically about performance, but landed like a verdict about character. An assignment of extra physical duties that had no official justification in the training record. She was careful. She knew that what she was doing was not neutral. A recruit documenting a senior drill sergeant was not something that ended well in most versions of this story. She understood that. She had thought through the possible outcomes with the methodical clarity she applied to everything that mattered. But she also understood something else. Her brother had not died because the military was a bad institution. He had died because bad things happen in dangerous circumstances, and he had accepted that risk because he believed in what the institution was supposed to stand for. And what it was supposed to stand for was not this. She met Rachel Adams at the end of week 5 during a night navigation exercise that went longer than planned. They ended up walking the last 2 miles back to base together in the dark. And somewhere in that walk, the careful silence that recruits maintained around each other in daylight hours broke open a little. He called me decorative, Rachel said. Emily turned her head. Sergeant Whitaker, during the marksmanship evaluation. He looked at my score, I qualified expert by the way, and he said, decorative, good for photographs. Rachel's voice was flat, like she had already used up the anger, and what was left was just the fact of it. And everyone around me heard it. Nobody said anything. What did you do? I said, thank you, Drill Sergeant, and I kept walking. Emily was quiet for a moment. Rachel, would you be willing to put that in writing? Rachel looked at her in the dark. You're documenting this. It was not a question. Yes. The silence stretched between them. An owl called somewhere off to their left. Their boots crunched through dry grass. He's going to find out, Rachel said finally. And when he does, I know. Do you? Yes. Emily paused. But here's what I also know. He's already finding out what I'm doing because I'm still here. I keep passing every evaluation. My scores don't give him what he needs to push me out the official way, so he's escalating. She kept her voice even. That escalation is also documentation. Rachel was quiet for a long time. Then she said, give me a date and time, and I'll write it out. The escalation. Emily had predicted came in week 7. It came first in the form of her physical training evaluations, which began returning with noted deficiencies that her actual performance did not support. She completed the 2-mile run in 13 minutes and 40 seconds. The evaluation sheet listed 14 minutes and 12 seconds. She checked the sheet twice, folded it carefully, and put it in the notebook. She asked Sergeant First Class Diane Torres, one of the cadre members who ran the timing for PT evaluations. A very simple and very specific question. Sergeant Torres, could you tell me the official procedure for disputing a timed evaluation result? Torres was a compact, direct woman who had been at Fort Campbell for 6 years. She looked at Emily for a moment with the careful expression of someone calculating risk. "You write a formal discrepancy report," Torres said. "You submit it through the chain of command within 48 hours. "Thank you, Sergeant Torres." Torres watched her walk away. Her expression did not change, but she filed something in her own memory that she would return to later at a moment that mattered. Emily filed the discrepancy report. It disappeared. She documented the submission and the absence of any formal response. The second escalation came from a direction she had not fully anticipated. Sergeant Whitaker called her into his office on a Wednesday afternoon in week 8. Just her. No witnesses. The door closed his desk between them and the weight of his 23 years in every square inch of that room. "Sit down, Carter." She sat. He did not look at her immediately. He looked at the papers on his desk, turned one over, set it down. A performance. She recognized it as a performance because she had watched him use it before. The deliberate pause, the suggestion of a man with so many important matters that he could afford to make you wait for his attention. When he finally looked at her, his expression was calm. That was the thing about Marcus Whitaker. He was almost never visibly angry. His cruelty was quiet. It wore the face of professional concern. "I'm going to be honest with you," he said. "I think you're struggling. I'm qualifying at the top of my cohort in most evaluations, Drill Sergeant. Numbers don't tell the whole story." He folded his hands on the desk. "I've been doing this for 23 years. I can see things that don't show up in numbers. And what I see in you is someone who is working very hard to hide the fact that she doesn't really belong here." Emily looked at him. She thought about her brother's photograph in her jacket pocket. She thought about Jason Miller sitting on the edge of his bunk staring at the floor. She thought about Rachel Adams saying decorative like the word had left a stain. "Drill Sergeant," she said, "could I ask what specific performance indicators are driving that assessment?" Something shifted behind his eyes. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder than anger. Recognition. He had expected her to fold, or to push back emotionally, to get frustrated, to raise her voice, to give him something he could use. Instead, she had asked him a procedural question in a professional tone, and now he was looking at a recruit who was in some way he couldn't fully articulate yet, not playing the game the way he had designed it. "You're dismissed, Carter." She stood, came to attention, and left. In the hallway, she wrote down the time, the date, and every word she could remember from the conversation. There is a particular kind of patience that is not passive. It is not waiting. It is not endurance. It is something more active than both of those things, a discipline of watching and recording and understanding, a willingness to let the situation develop rather than forcing it, because you understand that the truth becomes strongest when it has room to prove itself completely. Emily Carter had been practicing that kind of patience since she was 16 years old. Her father had been a civil rights attorney in Clarksville, Tennessee. He had spent 30 years in courtrooms, where the power imbalance was visible from the moment he walked through the door. He had won most of his cases. He had lost some of them. What he had never done, not once in 30 years, was let the visible imbalance make him forget his strategy. "The person who controls their emotions controls the room," he told her once, "even if they don't control anything else in it." She had thought of that sentence on the day she arrived at Fort Campbell. She thought of it again now, standing in the hallway outside Sergeant Whitaker's closed office door, her notebook open, her pen moving. The formal complaint she filed in week 9 was 4 pages long. It was organized chronologically. It included specific dates, specific times, specific language, and where available the names of other recruits who had witnessed or experienced similar treatment. It included her discrepancy report from the PT evaluation and the documentation of its non-response. It included Jason Miller's account and Rachel Adams's account, both recorded with their knowledge and their willingness to support the documentation. She submitted it through the proper chain of command as required. She also made a copy which she kept in the notebook. The official response was a form letter acknowledging receipt. Nothing happened for 11 days. Then Sergeant Whitaker changed. Not kinder. That would have required something he was not capable of offering, but more careful. The explicit comments disappeared. The specific targeting became harder to point to. Emily understood immediately, recalibrating. He had found out about the complaint. Of course he had found out the institution that was supposed to handle it had told him, because that was what institutions did when they wanted to manage a problem rather than solve one. And now he was being careful. Careful was not the same as stopped, but careful was also not the same as invisible. She kept documenting. The morning of the weapons inspection. Emily woke up before her alarm. She lay in her bunk in the pre-dawn quiet and thought carefully about the day in front of her. Not with anxiety. With the focused, forward-looking attention she applied to any situation where she understood the terrain. She understood this terrain. She knew that Whitaker would use the inspection as an opportunity. The formal complaint had made him more careful in private settings, but a formation inspection. 390 witnesses, a public ritual of hierarchy. His authority, visibly on display, was exactly the kind of situation where the careful version of him might slip back toward the habitual version. She had cleaned her rifle the previous evening with the methodical precision she applied to everything that mattered. Every component broken down, inspected, cleaned, inspected again, reassembled. She had done it twice. The rifle was by any objective measure perfect. She dressed in the dark quiet, as her father had once told her. A good argument should be not loud, not flashy, but with nothing in it that could be used against her. She tucked the notebook into her breast pocket. She went to formation. The inspection moved down the line with the practiced authority of a man who had conducted this ritual 10,000 times. Whitaker moved like water, finding the path of least resistance, certain, continuous, unhurried. He stopped at each recruit long enough to find something or to decide he would not find something. He was not interested in the rifle in his hand. He was interested in the message the rifle inspection sent. He stopped in front of Emily. He took her rifle. He turned it over. He looked down the barrel. He checked the bolt carrier group, the trigger group, the magazine well. He turned it over again. The field was absolutely quiet. Then he said, "Unacceptable." Emily felt the 390 people behind her. She felt the weight of the word. She felt very clearly the choice in front of her. She said, "Drill Sergeant, could you explain the specific deficiency?" The silence that followed was different from the one before it. Before, the silence had been the normal silence of a formation during inspection routine, expected, meaningless. This silence had texture. This silence had the quality of something about to break. Whitaker's eyes moved from the rifle to her face. "What did you say?" "I asked you to identify the specific deficiency, Drill Sergeant, so I can correct it." "You're questioning my inspection." "I'm asking for clarification so I can improve, Drill Sergeant." Around her, 389 recruits were not breathing. Whitaker stepped closer. I was inside her personal space now, which was a technique she had seen him use before, the physical proximity, designed to trigger the instinctive human response to step back. She did not step back. "You think," he said very quietly, "that you can stand in my formation and tell me how to do my job?" "I haven't told you anything, Drill Sergeant. I asked a question." "You have an attitude problem, Carter." "I have a question, Drill Sergeant, about a specific regulation." His jaw tightened. The smallest movement. But she saw it. And then his hand came up, and his fist closed around the collar of her uniform, and 390 soldiers witnessed something that none of them would ever fully forget. Not because it was the most violent thing that had ever happened on a training field. Because of what Emily Carter did in the moment it happened. Nothing. She stood exactly where she was. Her spine did not curve. Her eyes did not drop. Her breathing did not change. She let the moment exist completely. She let every person in that formation see it, absorb it, understand what it meant. And then she said quietly in a voice that was absolutely steady, "Everyone here is watching, Drill Sergeant." 4 words. 4 words that were not a threat, were not an accusation, were simply a fact stated in the calm tone of someone who had been preparing for exactly this moment for 14 weeks. His grip released. Not slowly, not dramatically. The way a man's grip releases when he suddenly understands what he has done. He stepped back. Emily smoothed her collar with one hand, the way you smooth a shirt after taking it out of a drawer. A small controlled gesture that said more than any argument could have. She looked at him. I have 14 weeks of documentation, Drill Sergeant, submitted through the proper channels, and now 390 witnesses. The decorated veteran, 2 silver stars, a combat infantryman badge, 23 years of authority built on the certainty that his power was larger than any challenge to it stood in front of a 24-year-old woman who had just taken everything he had and turned it into evidence. He had no answer. For the first time in 23 years, Marcus Whitaker had no answer. And the 390 people who watched it happened the ones who had been afraid, the ones who had stayed silent, the ones who had told themselves that this was just how training worked. Felt something shift inside them, the way the ground shifts before something buried finally breaks the surface. They had come to Fort Campbell to learn what it meant to be a soldier. That morning, standing in the heat with their weapons at their sides, and their breath held, and their eyes open, they were learning it. Not from the man with the medals, from the woman who refused to disappear. The moment Whitaker's grip released the field did not exhale. That was the thing. Nobody talked about afterward, how the silence after the collar grab was somehow heavier than the silence during it. Like the air itself had not yet decided what it was going to do with what it had just witnessed. 390 recruits stood in formation and processed the thing they had seen, and the processing was not clean or quick. It moved through them the way a current moves through water, invisible from the surface but changing everything underneath. Emily smoothed her collar one final time. She put her hands back at her sides. She looked forward. She was back in the position of a recruit in a formation before Whitaker had fully stepped away from her, which was the detail that would stick in the memory of everyone standing in that field long after the specific words had faded. She had not waited for his permission to compose herself. Whitaker turned and walked back toward the front of the formation. His pace was the same pace it always was measured, deliberate, the walk of a man who believed his authority was a fact of nature rather than a social agreement. But something had changed inside that walk. Something that the recruits closest to him could feel the way you feel. A temperature drop before a storm not visible yet, but already real. He reached the front of the formation. He turned to face them, and he said in a voice that was slightly too controlled, "Inspection is complete. Return to your regular training schedule." He walked away. Nobody moved for 3 full seconds. Then the formation broke, and the noise started, the low, urgent, almost breathless noise of 390 people who needed to say something about what they had just watched and didn't yet know the words for it. Emily walked toward the armory to return her rifle. She did not look to the left or the right. She kept her face even and her pace steady, and her breathing measured the way you keep all of those things when you know that the moment is not over and you cannot afford to behave as if it is. Jason Miller fell into step beside her without asking permission. Carter. Miller. That was... He stopped, started again. What just happened? An incident, she said. Documented. You knew he was going to do that. She did not answer immediately. They walked 12 more paces before she said anything. I knew the situation was going to escalate. I didn't know exactly how. But I've been preparing for escalation for 14 weeks, so I was ready for most versions of it. Jason was quiet for a moment. You're not afraid of him. That's not accurate, she said. I understand what he can do and what that means. That's different from not being afraid. He looked at her. Then what is it? It means I don't let the fear make my decisions. They reached the armory. She checked in her rifle. When she turned around, Jason was still standing there with the expression of a man who had just been handed something he didn't know how to carry yet. What do we do now? He asked. You go back to your training schedule, she said. I go write down exactly what happened with the time and the exact words while I still have them. And then we wait, she said. Because what happened this morning doesn't need me to make it mean something. It already means what it means. All I have to do is make sure the record is accurate. She left him standing outside the armory, with his hands at his sides, and something new in his expression that had not been there that morning. It was not quite resolution. It was not quite courage. It was something earlier than both of those things, the moment just before a person decides that silence is no longer the option they can live with. She recognized it because she had worn it herself once. The investigation was not announced. That was the first thing she noticed, the way the machinery of institutional response moved quietly when it finally moved at all. No formation briefing, no memo, no official communication to the recruits about what was happening or why. Just the appearance on a Thursday morning, 10 days after the inspection of 2 people in the cadre building who had not been there before. A man and a woman, both in uniform, both with the specific kind of contained professional attention that belonged to people whose job was to find out what had happened and who had let it happen. Emily learned their names from Rachel, who had better access to the informal information network that ran through the barracks like a secondary nervous system. "Inspector General," Rachel said, quiet, and close the way you say things in a space where being overheard matters. "Major Vivian Cross and a Captain somebody from the Judge Advocate General's office. They've been in the cadre building since 6 this morning." Emily looked at her. "Who called them?" "Nobody knows officially." Rachel paused. "Unofficially, Sergeant Torres submitted something, about a week ago." Emily processed that quietly. Sergeant First Class Diane Torres, who had told her exactly how to file a discrepancy report, who had watched her walk away from that conversation with the careful expression of someone calculating risk, who had apparently been doing some calculating of her own. "Is Torres going to be in trouble?" Emily asked. "I don't know, maybe." Rachel hesitated. "Does that change anything for you?" Emily thought about that for a moment. Really thought about it the way her father had taught her to think about things that mattered, not from the outside, not from the most convenient angle, but from the center where the actual truth lived. "No," she said. "It makes me more careful. It doesn't change the direction." Rachel nodded slowly. "They're going to want to talk to people," she said. "I know. Some of the recruits are scared. About what happens if they say something and it doesn't go anywhere. About what Whitaker does to them after." "That's a legitimate fear," Emily said. "I'm not going to tell anyone that it isn't." Rachel looked at her steadily. "But you're going to talk to them. I'm going to make sure they understand what the process is, what the protections are, what the documentation shows." She paused. "And then I'm going to let them decide, because this only works if it's their choice." She spoke to 9 people in the next 4 days. Not in groups. One at a time in the brief spaces that training schedules left open, 15 minutes before lights out. The walk between the mess hall and the barracks. The quiet edge of the PT field during the recovery period after morning runs. She was careful about how she did it. She did not recruit. She did not pressure. She asked questions, and she listened, and she offered the same 2 things to everyone. She talked to the factual information about what they were being asked to do, and the truth about what she was doing and why. The first conversation that surprised her was with a recruit named Derek Okafor. Derek was 26 years old, former college linebacker, physically the most impressive recruit in the cohort. He was also, Emily had noticed, one of the people Whitaker seemed to enjoy targeting in a particular way. Not with cruelty exactly, but with a kind of persistent testing that Derek responded to by working harder, trying to outperform the standard until the standard moved again. She found him after dinner on the second day, sitting alone, methodically going through his kit. She sat down across from him. He looked up. "Carter." "Okafor, can I ask you something?" "You can ask." "In week 3 during the land navigation exercise, Whitaker told you to redo the course. You had already passed it. I saw the time." Derek's hands slowed on the kit in front of him. "What about it? Did he give you a reason?" "He said my form was sloppy." "Was it?" A pause. "No," Derek said. "It was clean. I've been doing land navigation since I was 14. My uncle was Army. He taught me." Another pause. "But I did it again. And I did it better than the first time, just to prove something to myself." "You had to prove something to yourself because of what he said." "Yeah." "That's worth putting in writing," Emily said. "Not because it's dramatic, because it's part of the pattern." Derek set down the piece of kit he was holding. He looked at her with an expression that was complicated in the way that expressions are when a person has been carrying something for a long time and someone else has just acknowledged the weight. "You think they're actually going to do something?" he asked. "IG shows up, people talk, and then what? Man's got 23 years, 2 silver stars. You think they're going to throw all that away because some recruits are uncomfortable?" "I think the silver stars are real," Emily said. "I think the 23 years are real, and I think that doesn't mean what happened here was acceptable." "That's not what I asked." "I know it's not." She held his gaze. "I don't know what they're going to do. I can't promise you an outcome. What I can tell you is that the documentation is real, the witnesses are real, and what happened on the inspection field 10 days ago happened in front of 390 people. That's not a complaint, that's a fact." Derek was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "My little sister wants to enlist next year." Emily waited. "She's smart. She's strong. She'd be good at this." He looked down at his hands. "I'd want her to come somewhere that was going to make her better. Not somewhere that was going to spend a year trying to convince her she didn't belong." He looked up. "You understand what I'm saying?" "Yes," Emily said. "I understand exactly what you're saying." He picked up his kit again. "Tell me what you need me to write down." The second conversation that surprised her was one she did not initiate. She was in the hallway outside the barracks on the third evening when Sergeant First Class Torres appeared beside her, without any of the usual preceding sounds of approach, just suddenly there close enough that Emily had to adjust her stride. "Walk with me, Carter." It was not a request. They walked. Torres did not look at her. She looked forward straight ahead, the way you look when you are saying something in a place where being seen saying it matters. "You know I submitted a supplemental report," Torres said. "I heard that, Sergeant Torres. I want you to understand something." A brief pause. "What I submitted had nothing to do with your complaint specifically. It had to do with my own professional obligations." Emily nodded without speaking. "I've been in this army for 16 years, Torres said. "I've served under good people, and I've served under people who used the uniform to hide what they actually were. I know the difference. And my obligation is to the institution and to the soldiers in it, not to protecting the career of someone who is actively damaging both." She stopped walking. Emily stopped with her. Torres turned and looked at her directly for the first time. "I'm not your ally in the way you might want me to be," she said. "I'm not going to put myself between you and what's coming next. What I did because it was the right thing to do professionally, and I would have done it for any recruit in any situation." "I understand that," Emily said. "Good." Torres paused. "Your documentation is thorough. I've seen pieces of it through the chain. It's the kind of documentation that's difficult to dismiss because it doesn't have any visible emotion in it. Just facts." A slight pause. "Your father is an attorney." "He was. He's retired." "He taught you well." Emily did not answer immediately. She thought of her father at his desk in the study of their house in Clarksville, going through case files late at night, the lamplight making everything in the room look amber. She thought of the patient, persistent, utterly controlled way. He had approached every situation that the world had given him reason to approach with rage instead. "He taught me that the loudest argument in the room isn't always the strongest one," she said finally. Torres looked at her for a moment longer. Then she said, "Whitaker has people in his corner, people with ranks higher than mine. People who are going to say that his record speaks for itself, and that a formal complaint from a recruit is exactly the kind of thing the Army has always had to manage when difficult personalities encounter necessary discipline." She kept her voice level. "I want you to be prepared for the possibility that what you've done is not going to be enough." Emily met her eyes. "I know that's possible," she said. "I've known it since week 2. And you kept going." "My brother didn't get to stop," she said simply. "So I don't think I get to either." Torres was quiet. Whatever she was looking for. In Emily's face, she seemed to find it because she gave a single nod. Small, precise, the kind of nod that carried more weight than any spoken agreement. Then she turned and walked away without another word. Emily stood still for a moment. Then she took out her notebook and wrote down the conversation word for word, exactly as she remembered it. The twist arrived on the 8th day after the inspection, in a form nobody had predicted. Sergeant Marcus Whitaker requested a formal meeting with the Inspector General's office, not to respond to the complaint, to present a counter-documentation. Emily found out through Rachel, whose source was a supply clerk who serviced the cadre building and had a habit of noticing things that were not meant to be noticed. "He built a file," Rachel said. "On you, on us." Her voice was steady, but her hands, Emily noticed, were pressed flat against her thighs, the way Rachel pressed them when she was managing something harder than she wanted to show. Performance notes. Behavioral assessments. A pattern of what he's calling institutional defiance. He submitted it as evidence that your complaint is retaliatory. The word retaliatory sat in the air between them. Emily looked at it the way her father had taught her to look at the hardest words in a legal document, not emotionally, not reactively, but with the specific attention of someone trying to understand exactly how much damage the word could do. "How far back does his file go?" she asked. "Week 3, apparently. He started it 3 weeks before you submitted your complaint." Week 3. The same week, she had started noticing the pattern. The same week, Jason Miller had come back from that one-on-one session and sat on the edge of his bunk and stared at the floor. Whitaker had been building his own record. She had known he was a smart man. She had known he had spent 23 years learning how institutions protected themselves and how people within institutions could be managed, maneuvered, documented out of the way. She had known all of that. But the specific calculation of week 3 landed in her chest like something physical. "He saw what I was doing," she said. "Before you had anything solid," Rachel said. "Before you had enough." Emily was quiet for a long moment. Rachel watched her. "What does this do to the investigation?" Emily asked. "I don't know, but it complicates it. He's not just a defendant anymore, he's also a complainant. His story is that you've been systematically building a case against him out of personal grievance, and that the inspection incident was him responding to what he characterizes as a pattern of insubordination." Emily absorbed that. She thought about her notebook. 14 weeks of dates, times exact language corroborating witnesses. She thought about Derek Okafor agreeing to put in writing what had happened during the land navigation exercise. She thought about Jason and Rachel and the 6 others who had agreed to submit their own accounts. She thought about Sergeant Torres's supplemental report and the timing discrepancy in her PT evaluation and the formal complaint she had submitted 4 weeks before the inspection and the documented absence of any official response. She thought about the fact that Whitaker's counter-documentation had started in week 3, 1 week before she had met Jason, 3 weeks before she had met Rachel, 5 weeks before she had submitted anything through the proper channels. She thought about what that meant for the timeline, and then she felt something shift inside her. Not fear, not despair, but the specific clarifying sensation of a person who has just realized that what looked like a complication is actually the most important piece of evidence in the case. "Rachel," she said. "Yeah." "His file started in week 3. "Right. My first formally submitted document was week 9. Rachel looked at her. The calculation moved across her face slowly, and then all at once. "He started building a case against you before you did anything to trigger it," Rachel said. "Which means his file doesn't show retaliation," Emily said. "It shows premeditation. He identified me as a target before I had given him any official reason to. And everything he did after that, the evaluations, the pressure, the week 8 meeting, the inspection, was him executing a plan he had already made." Rachel stared at her. "You need to get that in front of the investigators," she said. "I know. Today." "I know," Emily said again. "I'm going to request a formal statement interview." She was already moving. "Will you come with me?" Rachel did not hesitate. "Yes," she said. "Let's go." The interview with Major Vivian Cross lasted 2 hours and 17 minutes. Emily had prepared for it the way her father had taught her to prepare for anything that mattered. Not by rehearsing answers, but by understanding the architecture of the situation so completely that she could answer whatever question came from whatever angle without losing the thread. Major Cross was not what Emily had expected. She was a small woman in her late 40s with reading glasses. She took off and put back on throughout the interview, and a quality of attention, so focused it felt almost physical. She did not lead with sympathy. She did not perform solidarity. She asked precise, specific questions in a tone that was professionally neutral, and she wrote down exactly what Emily said without visible reaction. That neutrality was. Emily understood the point. Major Cross was not there to believe her. She was there to assess whether the documented record was consistent, coherent, and supported by independent corroboration. Emily laid out the timeline. She laid out Whitaker's Week 3 documentation and what the timing of it implied. She laid out her own documentation, every incident, every date, every witness. She laid out the chain of complaint, the formal report in Week 9, the documented absence of response, the escalation that followed. She laid out the inspection. When she finished, Major Cross looked at her over her reading glasses. "You understood when you started documenting that this could go badly for you." "Yes, ma'am." "And you continued?" "Yes, ma'am." Why? Emily thought about Michael's photograph, about Jason's face in the dark of the barracks, about Rachel saying decorative in a flat voice that had already used up the anger. Because the people who were hurt by what was happening here didn't all have the tools to document it themselves, she said. And because I did have those tools, and I don't think having them means nothing. Major Cross looked at her for a long moment. She took off her glasses. She set them on the table in front of her. "Miss Carter," she said, "I've been in the Inspector General's office for 9 years. I've reviewed a lot of complaints. Most of them are real, and most of them are complicated, and most of them are very difficult to act on because the documentation is emotional rather than factual." She paused. "Yours is the most thoroughly documented formal complaint from an enlisted recruit I have encountered in 9 years of this work." Emily held that. She did not let herself feel it yet. She kept her face level and her hands still in her lap. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Major Cross said, "we talk to everyone else on your list. And we look very carefully at the timeline." She put her glasses back on. "And Sergeant Whitaker answers some questions about Week 3. That night, Emily sat on the edge of her bunk after lights out and held Michael's photograph in the dark. She did not cry. She was not built for crying in the way some people were, the way it came easily and moved through them cleanly. For Emily, emotion moved like water through rock, slowly, pressurefully, finding its way through whatever small openings were available. She thought about what her brother had told her about steadiness. She thought about 9 years of an Inspector General saying the most thoroughly documented complaint she had encountered. She thought about Whitaker sitting somewhere in this same building, his file in front of him, his 23 years behind him, the silver stars reel, and the damage reel, and the Week 3 timeline now in the hands of someone whose job it was to understand exactly what that meant. She thought about Derek Okafor's little sister who wanted to enlist next year. She thought about the 390 people who had stood in that field and watched what they had watched, and who were tonight somewhere in this building or in their memories of this morning, working out what they had seen and what it meant and what they were going to do with it. She put the photograph back in her pocket. She lay down. She closed her eyes. She was not done. The investigation was not done. The outcome was not guaranteed, and Whitaker was still, as of this moment, a decorated drill sergeant with 23 years and 2 silver stars, and people in his corner whose ranks were higher than Torres, and whose institutional interest was in the story staying manageable. She knew all of that. She also knew something else. The truth was in the record now, and records her father had told her once survived the people who tried to bury them. Not always. Not perfectly, but more often than the people doing the burying expected. She breathed. She slept. She woke up to the sound of boots in the hallway, not the normal morning sound. The gradual build of a barracks coming to life, the staggered rhythm of people moving at different speeds toward the same destination. This was different, deliberate, focused. The sound of people who had somewhere specific to be and had been told to get there quickly. Emily was on her feet before she was fully awake, the way soldiers learn to be, the way her brother had described it. Not panic, just the body responding to signals the mind was still catching up to. Rachel appeared in the doorway of her bunk section. "They pulled Whitaker," she said. Emily went still. "What do you mean pulled?" "Relieved of training duties. Effective this morning. He's been reassigned to administrative holding pending the investigation outcome." Rachel's voice was controlled, but her eyes were doing something else entirely. "It happened at 0500. The whole cadre knows. Half the barracks knows already." Emily sat back down on the edge of her bunk. She did not feel what she had expected to feel. She had imagined this moment a dozen times over the past 4 weeks. The moment the institution moved, the moment the machinery finally engaged, and in those imagined versions, she had felt something like relief, something like vindication, something with clean edges and a clear emotional shape. What she actually felt was complicated in ways she did not have words for yet. "Who's taking his position?" she asked. "Sergeant First Class Torres, temporary reassignment." Emily absorbed that. Torres, who had told her explicitly that she was not her ally in the way she might want, who had done what she did out of professional obligation, not solidarity. Who was Emily had come to understand exactly the kind of person the institution needed more of, someone whose loyalty was to the standard rather than to the person enforcing it. "Is Torres going to be okay?" Emily asked. Rachel looked at her with an expression that was caught somewhere between exasperation and something warmer. "You're asking about Torres?" She took a real risk, submitting that supplemental report. "Carter." Rachel stepped inside the bunk section and lowered her voice. "The man who has been targeting you for 14 weeks just got pulled from his position. Can you just for one moment, can you let yourself have that?" Emily looked at her. She thought about everything she had written in that notebook. The dates and times and exact words, the careful, patient accumulation of a record that was designed to survive without emotion, the way her father had taught her. She thought about the 14 weeks of controlled response, of absorbing the pressure and converting it into documentation rather than reaction. She thought about Michael's photograph in her pocket, and then quietly sitting on the edge of her bunk in the early morning, with Rachel watching her and the sound of boots still moving in the hallway, she let herself feel it. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a slow release of something she had been holding very tightly for a very long time. "Okay," she said. "Okay." Rachel sat down next to her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "It's not over," Emily said finally. "I know. Pulling him from training duties is not the same as a finding. The investigation is still open. His people are still working for him. He still has the counter-documentation and the retaliation narrative and 23 years of institutional credibility behind him." "I know all of that," Rachel said. "But he's not standing in front of our formation anymore." That was true. Emily let that be true for another full minute before she stood up, straightened her uniform, and started thinking about what came next. What came next arrived faster than she expected, and from a direction she had not fully mapped. It arrived in the form of a man named Colonel Richard Hargrove. She did not learn his name immediately. She learned it in pieces, the way information moved through a barracks, fragments from different sources that assembled themselves into a picture over the course of a single afternoon. Colonel Hargrove was Whitaker's former commanding officer. They had served together in 2 deployments. Hargrove was now in a position that sat 3 levels above the training cadre at Fort Campbell, which meant he had no direct authority over the investigation, but had the kind of indirect weight that institutions responded to, the way water responds to pressure, by finding the path that required the least resistance. The first fragment came from Jason Miller, who had heard it from a recruit who worked in the administrative offices. "Hargrove called the installation commander this morning," Jason said, "about an hour after Whitaker was pulled. About the investigation. About Whitaker's service record, his contributions, his combat deployments." Jason paused. "About the damage to the institution's credibility if a decorated veteran's career is ended based on a recruit complaint." Emily processed that carefully. He didn't mention the counter-documentation. He mentioned that the situation was more complicated than it appeared from the outside. More complicated. She recognized that language. It was the language institutions used when they wanted to protect someone without defending the specific thing that person had done. The reframing of accountability as complexity. The suggestion that justice, if applied too directly, would damage something larger and more important than the individual case. She had grown up watching her father fight that language in courtrooms for 30 years. "Is the installation commander going to respond?" she asked. "I don't know yet." The second fragment came from Rachel 2 hours later. "Two of the recruits who agreed to give statements are wavering," Rachel said. Her voice was flat, which was how Rachel's voice got when she was managing something that made her want to do something louder. "One of them got a call from his family last night. His father is career military. He told his son that making an enemy of a decorated drill sergeant was not a career decision that would age well." Emily closed her eyes for a single second. Which recruits? Marcus Webb and Tyler Cho. She knew both of them. Webb was 23 from a military family in Georgia, smart and capable, and carrying the specific weight of someone who had been raised to believe that institutional loyalty was indistinguishable from personal honor. Cho was quieter, more self-contained, a recruit who had given his statement with the careful, measured language of someone who had thought about every word before he said it. "Have they formally withdrawn?" she asked. "Not yet, but the investigator needs to know soon whether they're still willing to testify." Emily thought. She thought about what she could say to them and what she should not say, about the line between sharing information and applying pressure, about the fact that this only worked if it was their choice. And she had told herself that from the beginning, and she needed to hold that even now, especially now when the thing she had built over 14 weeks was starting to feel the weight of everything pushing against it. "I'm not going to talk to them," she said. Rachel looked at her. "Carter, I'm not going to talk to them. Not because I don't want to, because it's not my place to." She kept her voice even. "If they withdraw, they withdraw. Their statements are already in the record as submitted. That doesn't disappear. Their testimony in person is different from a written statement." "I know. And if Whitaker's lawyers get in front of that distinction—" "I know," Emily said again. "But if I go to them now when they're being pressured and I try to change their minds, even with good arguments, even with honest information, I become the thing Whitaker said I was. Someone who pressures people to serve her agenda." She looked at Rachel directly. "I will not give him that. Not now. Not when we're this close." Rachel stared at her for a long moment. "You're unbelievable," she said finally. And it was not a simple thing. The way she said it, it carried admiration and frustration in equal proportion, pressed together in the way of two things that do not fully resolve. "I'm my father's daughter," Emily said. The third fragment arrived that evening, and it was the one that changed everything. It came from Derek Okafor, who knocked on the doorframe of her bunk section at 1900 hours, with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the contained determination she had come to associate with him, but something rawer. Something that had been through a harder process to get where it was. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Come in." He sat down. He did not speak immediately. He turned his hands over in his lap, looked at them, turned them back. "My mother called me tonight," he said. Emily waited. "She's been following what's happening. Not the details, she doesn't have the details. But she heard from someone that I was involved in something that might affect my service record." He paused. She was scared. She didn't say it that way, but that's what it was. "That's a reasonable thing for a mother to feel," Emily said carefully. "Yeah." He looked up. "She asked me to think about what I was doing and whether it was worth what it might cost me. Whether one situation was worth my entire career." A pause. "And I thought about it." The silence stretched. Emily did not fill it. "My uncle, the one who taught me land navigation, he was at Fort Hood in 2003, Derek said. He was a staff sergeant, good at his job. And his company commander was a man who treated certain soldiers a specific way. You understand what I'm saying?" "Yes," she said quietly. "My uncle documented it. He submitted a complaint. And that complaint went nowhere. And that company commander retired with full honors 2 years later. And my uncle got out of the army at 8 years because he couldn't stay in a place that had told him so clearly what he was worth." Derek was quiet for a moment. He told me that story once, when I was 18, and I asked him if he regretted making the complaint, and he said no. He said the only thing he regretted was that there had been nobody else beside him when he made it. Emily felt something move through her chest that she did not try to name. "Derek," she said. "I'm not withdrawing my statement," he said. "I want you to know that. My mother's fear is real, and my career concerns are real, and none of that changes what I saw, and what happened to me, and what I agreed to put in writing." He looked at her steadily. "I also talked to Webb and Cho tonight." She went very still. "You talked to them. I didn't pressure them. I told them my uncle's story. I told them that whatever they decided I understood, and then I told them that I was going to be standing there whether they were or not." He paused. "I figured that was the kind of information that was theirs to have." Emily looked at him for a long moment. "What did they say?" "They said they'd sleep on it." She nodded. "Thank you," she said. Derek stood up. He was already halfway to the door when he stopped and turned back. "Your brother," he said. "What was he like?" The question caught her off guard. She had not spoken to many people here about Michael, not in detail, not the way the question invited. "How was steady?" she said. "That was the word I always thought of. Not hard, not loud, steady." She paused. He could walk into a room full of people who were afraid and make them less afraid just by being in it. Not because he told them not to be scared. Just because the way he carried himself said that it was possible to be all right. Derek nodded slowly. "That's what you do," he said simply. He left. Emily sat with that for a long time. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday. The formal investigative hearing, the moment the collected testimony, the documentation, the counter-documentation, and the Week 3 timeline would be laid out in front of a panel and assessed against each other. The night before, Emily did not sleep well. Not because she was afraid of the hearing itself. She knew the documentation. She trusted the timeline. She trusted Major Cross's professionalism and Torres's supplemental report and the 7 statements that were still committed and standing. What kept her awake was something she had not expected. She kept thinking about Marcus Whitaker, not with sympathy. She had moved well past the point where she needed to protect herself from sympathy. She understood what he had done and why it was wrong, and the understanding was solid and did not wobble. But somewhere beneath the understanding was something more complex, something that she suspected was the cost of seeing people clearly rather than simply. Marcus Whitaker had been once a person who joined the Army for reasons that had something to do with service. His combat record was real. The men he had brought home were real. The deployments were real, and the danger had been real, and at some point in some version of the story, he had been someone who could stand in front of soldiers and mean something. The question she kept returning to was not whether his record excused his actions. She knew it did not. She had known that from week 1, from the moment she understood the difference between discipline and humiliation. The question was at what point had he stopped knowing the difference himself? At what point does authority become the thing that replaces your judgment instead of serving it? She did not have a complete answer. But she thought it had something to do with the absence of accountability over a long period of time. The way unchecked power doesn't just corrupt, it atrophies. The way a man who has never been held responsible for how he uses his authority eventually loses the ability to see that authority can be misused at all. She thought about that until close to midnight. Then she put Michael's photograph on top of her notebook on the small shelf above her bunk where she could see both of them, and she closed her eyes. Thursday morning arrived with the specific weight of days that have been given a function larger than themselves. Emily was dressed and in the hallway before anyone else in her section was awake. She was not anxious. She was focused, which was a different thing. The channeling of energy toward a single point, rather than its dispersal in multiple directions. She walked to the administration building. She was 30 feet from the entrance when she saw Webb and Cho standing outside. They were not alone. Derek was with them. Jason was behind them. Rachel was to the left, her arms folded across her chest, Her expression, the calibrated neutral of someone who had decided not to let anyone see how much this moment cost her. Webb looked at Emily when she approached. He was visibly uncomfortable, not ashamed, but carrying the specific discomfort of a person who has made a decision that required more from them than they initially budgeted for. "We're here," he said. 2 words. But Emily understood everything that had gone into them. The phone call from his father, the military family, the weight of institutional loyalty, pressing down on a 23-year-old who had been raised to believe that loyalty was the highest value and was now having to figure out what it meant when the institution and the standard pulled in different directions. "I know it wasn't easy," she said. "It wasn't," he said plainly. He did not elaborate, and she did not ask him to. Cho said nothing. He just nodded once, the same careful, measured gesture he used for everything important, and then looked forward at the building entrance. They went in together. The hearing panel consisted of 3 people. Major Vivian Cross, a lieutenant colonel from the Judge Advocate General's office named Merritt, and a brigadier general named Sandra Kwan, who had been brought in from the regional command to provide senior-level oversight. Emily had not known about Kwan until she walked into the room. She processed the significance quickly. A brigadier general present meant this had moved beyond a standard IG investigation. Someone at a level above the installation had decided this required oversight that could not be provided internally. Someone had decided that the conflict of interest inherent in the institution, investigating itself, needed to be managed by importing authority from outside the immediate chain. She did not know if that was good. She did not know if it was bad. She knew it was significant. Whitaker was seated at the opposite table in dress uniform. His service ribbons were arranged in the specific order that military protocol required, which meant the silver stars were visible in exactly the position where they were designed to be seen first. He had an attorney, a civilian, which told Emily that he had retained personal legal representation, which told her that his institutional backers had decided the formal process required more than informal protection. He did not look at her when she entered the room. She did not look at him either. Major Cross opened the proceedings with a recitation of the investigative timeline, when the complaint was filed, when the counter-documentation was submitted, when the administrative holding was placed, what the investigation had produced. When she reached the week 3 timeline, the room changed. Emily felt it without looking up from the table in front of her. The quality of attention in the space shifted in the way it shifts when people who have been listening politely suddenly start listening for real. The counter-documentation submitted by Sergeant Whitaker begins in the 3rd week of the training cycle, Major Cross said. The formal complaint filed by Private Carter was submitted in week 9. This panel will be asked to assess whether the timeline of the counter-documentation is consistent with the retaliation narrative presented by Sergeant Whitaker's counsel, or whether it suggests an alternative sequence of events. Whitaker's attorney leaned over and said something quietly in his ear. Whitaker's jaw tightened. Emily kept her hands still in her lap, and her breathing even, and her face level, the way her father had taught her to sit in rooms where the outcome was not yet certain, and every visible thing was being read. Then Lieutenant Colonel Merritt spoke. "Private Carter, I'd like to ask you directly. The documentation you submitted through the chain of command in week 9, was that your first attempt to formally raise a concern about Sergeant Whitaker's conduct?" "No, sir." A pause. "Explain." "In week 6, I verbally reported a specific incident to a cadre member during a structured feedback session. That verbal report was acknowledged, but not formally recorded. In week 7, I submitted a written concern through the informal resolution channel before escalating to the formal complaint in week 9. I have the submission confirmation for the week 7 report in my documentation." Another pause. Longer this time. "You submitted a written concern in week 7. "Yes, sir." "And you have documentation of that submission?" "Yes, sir." Merritt looked at Major Cross. Major Cross looked at her notes. She said quietly and precisely, "The week 7 submission was not included in the materials provided to this panel during the initial investigation phase." The room was very quiet. "Private Carter," Brigadier General Kwan said. She had not spoken until now, and her voice when it came had the specific quality of authority that does not need volume direct measured, completely in control of the space it occupied. Do you have the original documentation with you today? Yes, General. Emily reached into the folder in front of her and removed the Week 7 submission, the confirmation record, and the notation of non-response. She passed it to the officer who collected materials from witnesses. The officer brought it to the panel table. Kwan picked it up. She read it. She set it down and looked across the room, not at Emily, not at Whitaker, but at the space between them, the way you look when you are looking at a situation rather than a person. Then she said something that Emily would replay for years afterward. Sergeant Whitaker, in your counter-documentation, you describe Private Carter's complaint as a surprise escalation designed to damage your career without prior warning or attempt at informal resolution. Kwan's voice did not change in tune or pace. We now have a document suggesting that Private Carter attempted informal resolution 6 weeks before the formal complaint was filed. Would you like to revise your characterization of the timeline? The silence that followed was 11 seconds long. Emily counted them. Whitaker looked at his attorney. His attorney looked at the panel. The attorney's expression was the professional neutral of a man who has just discovered that the situation he was hired to manage has shifted in a direction he was not briefed on. Then Whitaker looked at the panel, and for the first time since Emily had known him since the first morning she had stood in his formation and felt the weight of his attention and started trying to understand the shape of what she was looking at for the first time, Marcus Whitaker had no prepared answer. He said, "I would need to review the document." "You have 30 seconds, Kwan said. She was not being cruel, she was simply being precise. The attorney put the document in front of Whitaker. Whitaker read it. He set it down. He looked at the panel. "I was not aware of that submission," he said. "You were not aware," Kwan repeated. "No, General. The submission was made through the informal resolution channel, which runs through the Cadre Administrative Office, which is under your supervision." A pause. "Yes, General. So either you were aware and chose to characterize the situation inaccurately to this panel," Kwan said, "or a formal concern submitted by a recruit under your command moved through your administrative structure without your knowledge, which raises its own serious questions about how concerns are being managed in your unit." Another silence. Emily felt something inside her go very quiet and very clear. Not triumph, which was not what this felt like, but something closer to what she imagined her father felt in courtrooms when the truth finally found the shape that could hold it. Whitaker said nothing. His attorney leaned forward and said, "General Kwan, I'd like to request a brief recess." "Denied," Kwan said. She picked up her pen. "Sergeant Whitaker, I'm going to ask you one more question, and I would like you to think carefully before you answer." She looked at him directly. "When did you begin documenting Private Carter's behavior, and what specifically prompted you to begin that documentation?" The hearing room was absolutely silent. Whitaker looked at his hands. Then he looked at the panel. And somewhere in the long pause before he spoke, something changed in his face. Not remorse exactly, not yet, but the first crack in the surface of a structure that had been built over 23 years and had just in this room in this moment met something it could not withstand. "Week 3, he said. "And what prompted it?" Another pause. "I recognized," he said slowly, "that she was observing me." The room absorbed that. Emily absorbed it. He had started documenting her because he had seen her watching him. Because he had recognized in week 3 that this particular recruit was paying a different kind of attention than he was accustomed to. And instead of asking himself what she was watching for and what it might mean about what he was doing, he had responded by beginning to build a case against her, which meant that everything he had done after week 3, every evaluation, every escalation, the week 8 meeting, the inspection, the collar had been on some level an attempt to eliminate a witness before she could become one. Major Cross was writing. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt was writing. Brigadier General Kwan was not writing. She was looking at Marcus Whitaker with the expression of a person who has just heard exactly what she needed to hear and who understands precisely what it means, and who will carry the weight of what it means with the specific seriousness of someone for whom the institution is not an abstraction. Emily put her hands flat on the table in front of her and felt the solid surface beneath her palms and breathed. The truth was in the room now, all of it, and it did not need her to do anything else with it. The recess that Whitaker's attorney had requested and been denied came anyway. 40 minutes later, when Brigadier General Kwan called a 15-minute break without explanation, Emily walked into the hallway and stood against the wall and breathed. Jason appeared beside her almost immediately, with the instinct he had developed over the past several weeks of knowing when to show up without being asked. "How is it going in there?" he said quietly. "He admitted it," she said. "He admitted he started documenting me because he saw me watching him." Jason stared at her. "He said that?" "In front of the panel, on the record." Jason put his hand over his mouth. It was a gesture she had not seen from him before, the physical containment of something too large for a normal expression. "Carter," he said through his hand. "I know. I know." He dropped his hand. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at her. His eyes were bright in a way that was not entirely composed. "Your brother would have—" He stopped. "Yeah," she said. "He would have." They stood there for a moment, side by side against the wall, in the particular silence of people who have been through something together and do not need to name all of it to share it. Then Derek came around the corner with Rachel and Cho and Webb behind him, and the hallway filled with the low, urgent energy of people who had been sitting in an anteroom for 2 hours, waiting for fragments of information, and were now assembling those fragments into something they could hold. Emily told them what had happened. She kept it factual. Exact words, exact sequence, exact panel response. She watched their faces move through what the information was doing to them. The same slow, clarifying process she had felt inside the hearing room, the same shift from uncertainty to something more solid. Webb was the one who surprised her. He had been the quietest of the group since the morning they went into the building together, carrying the weight of his decision with the contained focus of someone who has spent everything he had just to get to the door and is now conserving what's left. But when Emily finished telling them about Whitaker's answer week 3, because he saw her watching, Webb looked at the floor, and something in his face moved in a way that had nothing to do with composure. "My father told me to trust the institution," he said. Quietly. Not bitterly. Just stating it. Nobody responded immediately. "I do trust it," he said. "I think the institution is worth trusting. I just think that trusting something means believing it can do better than it's been doing, not believing it's already perfect." He looked up. "That's why I'm here." Emily looked at him for a long moment. "That's the right reason," she said. He nodded once. He looked steadier than he had that morning, which was what happened sometimes when a person found out that the thing they were afraid of was not as large as the fear had made it seem. The recess ended. They went back inside. The second half of the hearing was different from the first, in the way that situations are different once the central weight-bearing structure has been revealed and tested. The formal questioning continued, panel members reviewing specific incidents from Emily's documentation, cross-referencing testimony with dates, asking Whitaker's attorney to respond to specific evidentiary points. But the atmosphere had changed in the way that rooms change when everyone in them understands that the fundamental question has already been answered, and what remains is the work of formalizing that answer into something the institution can act on. Whitaker's attorney was professional and thorough, and entirely unable to change what his client had said on the record in the first half of the hearing. The attorney argued that the week 3 documentation was consistent with a drill sergeant, exercising appropriate supervisory attention to a recruit whose behavior had raised legitimate concerns. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt asked him to explain what behavior specifically had raised concerns in week 3. The attorney said that Private Carter's pattern of detailed observation of cadre members was atypical and had warranted monitoring. Merritt looked at him. "Observation," he said. "Yes, sir." "A recruit observing her drill sergeant's conduct warranted counter-documentation." A pause. "In Sergeant Whitaker's professional judgment, yes." Merritt wrote something down. Emily could not see what it was. She did not need to. Major Cross asked Emily to confirm the specific date of her Week 7 informal resolution submission. Emily confirmed it. Cross asked Whitaker's attorney whether his client had any awareness of the submission at the time of its filing. The attorney asked for a moment to confer. Whitaker leaned close, and they exchanged words that Emily could not hear. Then the attorney straightened and said, "Sergeant Whitaker maintains that the submission did not come to his direct attention." "The submission was routed through his administrative office," Cross said. "Yes." "Supervised by personnel under his command." "Yes." "And his position is that it did not reach him." "That is his position, yes." Cross made a note. Emily watched her make it and understood from the specific economy of Cross's expression that the note meant something precise. That the two possible explanations for the Week 7 submission not reaching Whitaker, that he had not known, or that he had known and had not acted, were both in their different ways exactly what they appeared to be. Either way, a recruit's formal concern had moved through his administrative structure and disappeared. Either he had not built a system capable of transmitting it, or he had built a system capable of making it disappear. Neither of those was a finding the institution could walk away from. The hearing ended at 1400 hours. No formal finding was announced that day. Major Cross explained that the panel would deliberate and submit its findings to the installation commander within 10 business days, and that all parties would be formally notified of outcomes through the appropriate channels. Emily walked out of the administration building into the afternoon heat and stood still for a moment. Rachel was beside her immediately. "You okay?" "I think so. That was 2 hours." "It was 2 hours and 43 minutes. Rachel gave her a look. "Of course you counted." Emily almost smiled. "It's a documentation habit." They walked together toward the barracks. Around them, the normal rhythms of a training installation continued: physical training in one area, vehicle maintenance in another, the distant percussion of weapons qualification somewhere beyond the tree line. The machinery of the place, moving without pause, indifferent to the specific weight of what had happened in one administration building that afternoon. Emily found that oddly comforting. Not because the indifference didn't matter, but because the continuity meant the institution was real and large, and worth the effort of holding accountable. You didn't fight for something you had already given up on. "What do you think they're going to find?" Rachel asked. "I think the evidence is clear," Emily said. "What they do with it depends on things I can't fully control. How much weight Hargrove's involvement carries. Whether the installation commander has the institutional courage to act on a clean finding against a decorated sergeant. And if they don't act on it, then we go up the chain," Emily said. "There are channels above the installation commander. There are IG offices above the installation IG. There are congressional oversight structures." She paused. "I know the documentation. I know the timeline. I know what the panel heard today. None of that disappears if this level of the institution chooses not to act on it." Rachel walked beside her in silence for a moment. "You've thought about this every possible direction, haven't you?" "I've thought about it in the directions I know how to think about," Emily said. "My father spent 30 years in law. He taught me that the most important thing about pursuing accountability through institutions is that you can't stop being strategic when it gets hard. The moment you let emotion replace strategy is the moment the other side wins." "Does it ever get to you, staying that controlled?" The question landed somewhere real. Emily let it. "It costs something," she said. "Every day. Staying inside the strategy when every instinct in you wants to say things louder and harder, and without the careful professional language." She paused. "But my brother died in service to an institution he believed could be better than its worst moments. And the least I can do for him is try to actually make it better. Not just feel righteous about how wrong it was." Rachel was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I'm glad you were here, Carter." "I'm glad you were here too," Emily said. And she meant it in the full specific weight of the phrase, not as a courtesy, but as the truth about what it had meant to have Rachel beside her through 14 weeks of careful, patient, deliberate work. What it had meant to not be doing this alone. The twist that Emily had not anticipated came 3 days later. It came in the form of a name she had not encountered in any of the documentation, any of the testimony, any of the institutional chains she had spent 14 weeks mapping. The name was Sergeant First Class Andre Coleman. Coleman was a former soldier who had served under Whitaker 12 years earlier in a unit stationed at Fort Bragg. He was now a veteran out of the service for 7 years, working in private security in Georgia. He had contacted the Inspector General's office on his own initiative 2 days after news of the investigation had reached whatever informal network connected people who had served together. Emily found out from Torres, who called her into the office she was now using as the temporary training cadre supervisor. Torres closed the door. She sat down behind the desk and looked at Emily with the same professional directness she brought to everything. Coleman reached out to the IG office voluntarily, Torres said. He served under Whitaker from 2011 to 2013. He's provided a statement describing a pattern of conduct that mirrors what you documented. Emily went still. 12 years ago, she said. 12 years ago. Torres paused. He described specific incidents where Whitaker identified soldiers he had decided did not belong and systematically built records against them until they either transferred or separated. Coleman himself was one of those soldiers. He transferred to another unit after 7 months. Emily absorbed this. He never filed a formal complaint at the time. He was 23 years old, and Whitaker had 3 times his rank and a combat record that made the chain of command functionally untouchable. Torres kept her voice even. He did what most people do in that situation. He found a way to survive it and left. And now he's coming forward. Because he saw the news. Because someone from his old unit who still serves at Fort Campbell reached out to him. Torres looked at her directly. Because you made it possible for him to do this without being the only person doing it. Emily put her hands flat on the desk in front of her, a gesture she had not planned, the body expressing something the mind was still catching up to. What does this do to the investigation? She asked. It changes the scope, Torres said. What was being assessed as an isolated conduct issue has now acquired historical pattern evidence. That is a materially different evidentiary situation. She paused. It also substantially complicates Colonel Hargrove's position. Emily looked at her. Hargrove was at Fort Bragg in 2011, Torres said quietly. He was Whitaker's commanding officer during the period Coleman is describing. The information landed in the room with a weight that neither of them tried to immediately move around. If Hargrove had been Whitaker's commanding officer during the period Coleman was describing, if the pattern that Emily had documented in the present had been operational 12 years ago under Hargrove's command, then Hargrove's phone call to the installation commander 3 days ago was not simply an advocate going to bat for a decorated veteran. It was a man trying to contain the exposure of something that implicated him. Torres, Emily said. Yes. Does the panel know about Hargrove's involvement? The phone call. A pause. Major Cross is aware that contact was made, Torres said carefully. I believe General Kwan is also aware. What they do with that awareness is within their discretion. But they know. They know. Emily nodded slowly. She thought about Hargrove making that phone call. The institutional weight of a colonel calling an installation commander on behalf of a sergeant. The specific pressure of that. The suggestion that the institution's credibility was at stake. The framing of accountability as threat. She thought about how that call would have landed if Coleman had not existed, if the pattern had not extended back 12 years, if the story had remained the story of one young recruit and one decorated drill sergeant, and the institutional incentives pointing strongly toward managing it quietly. Coleman changed the shape of it. Coleman made it impossible to contain. She spoke to Coleman herself that evening on a video call arranged through the IG office with Major Cross present as a procedural observer. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 30s, with the quiet economy of movement that some veterans carried. The way they carried their service, not as a performance, just as a thing that had become part of how they took up space in the world. He looked at her across the screen with the expression of someone who has made a decision that cost him something and has accepted the cost. Private Carter, he said. Sergeant Coleman, thank you for calling. I should have done something like this 12 years ago, he said. I want you to know I understand that. You were 23, she said. That's not an excuse. No, she agreed. But it's a context. He looked at her for a moment. You sound like you've thought about this a lot. I've thought about why people don't speak up a lot, she said. And I've thought about what it costs them not to, and what it costs the people who come after them. She paused. I'm glad you're speaking up now. What? The documentation, the formal channels, staying inside the process. That's not easy, he said. Most people crack under the pressure, or let it get emotional, and then the other side uses the emotion to reframe the whole thing. My father is an attorney, she said. He taught me that the moment you make it about how you feel is the moment you lose control of what it's about. Coleman nodded. Smart man. He is. A pause. I want to ask you something directly, he said. Ask. Do you think they're going to do the right thing, the institution, the panel, the installation commander, if it gets that far? She thought about that honestly. I think the evidence is stronger than anything that can be assembled against it, she said. I think what you've provided adds a dimension that makes it very difficult for the institution to characterize this as an isolated incident or a personality conflict. And I think Brigadier General Kwan is the kind of officer who cares more about what the institution should be than about protecting what it has been. But you're not certain. I'm not certain, she said. No. Coleman was quiet for a moment. What do you do if they don't? I go up the chain, she said. As many levels as it takes. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, not surprise exactly, but recognition. The recognition of a person who sees something in front of them that they have been trying to find for a long time without knowing it was what they were looking for. Yeah, he said. Okay. He nodded once. Yeah. The finding came on a Friday morning, 7 days after the hearing. Emily was in the middle of a physical training session when Torres appeared at the edge of the PT field and made eye contact with her. She broke from the formation. She walked to Torres. Torres handed her a single sheet of paper. Emily read it. She read it twice. The panel's finding was formal, precise, and complete. Sergeant First Class Marcus Whitaker was found to have engaged in a sustained pattern of conduct inconsistent with Army values and training regulations, including targeted harassment of specific recruits, systematic suppression of formal concerns through his administrative chain, and physical misconduct during a formation inspection. The finding recommended immediate separation proceedings and a formal review of all training records produced under his supervision for the period of his tenure at Fort Campbell. The finding also recommended a separate inquiry into the administrative processes by which Private Carter's Week 7 informal resolution submission had been received and not acted upon, an inquiry that, given the newly established connection to Sergeant First Class Coleman's experience at Fort Bragg, would include a review of the relevant command structure during the 2011 to 2013 period. Colonel Richard Hargrove was named in that recommendation, not as a finding against him, not yet, but as a subject of inquiry. Emily lowered the paper. Torres was watching her. The installation commander accepted the panel's recommendation, Torres said. This morning, Whitaker has been formally notified. Emily looked at the paper again. At the specific formal institutional language that contained everything she had built over 14 weeks, the dates and times and exact words, the patient accumulation of a record designed to survive without emotion. And Coleman, she asked. Coleman's statement has been formally incorporated into the investigation record. He's been advised that he may be contacted for follow-up as the Fort Bragg inquiry develops. Emily nodded. She thought about Coleman at 23, finding the way to survive and getting out. She thought about the other recruits who had passed through Whitaker's formations over 12 years and had not had the tools or the support or the particular combination of circumstance and preparation that had made it possible for her to do what she had done. She thought about the ones who had simply left. The ones who had decided the institution had told them what it thought they were worth and had accepted that verdict. She thought about Derek Okafor's sister, who wanted to enlist next year. Torres, she said. Carter. What happens to the recruits from Whitaker's current cycle? Their evaluations, their records from the past 14 weeks under his supervision. What happens to those? Torres looked at her with the expression she had come to associate with the sergeant in the moments when she allowed herself to be slightly less than fully composed. "That's under review," she said, "along with everything else. I want to make sure that everyone in this cohort knows they can request a formal review of any evaluation that was produced under his supervision. Every recruit, not just the ones who came forward. That's within the IG office's authority to recommend," Torres said. "I'll make sure Major Cross is aware of your concern." "Thank you." Torres paused. "Carter, you should know something." She was choosing her words with the care she brought to statements that mattered. "What you built here, the documentation, the timeline, the formal process maintained at every step, that is the reason this finding is what it is. Without the evidentiary foundation you created, Coleman's testimony would have been a historical account without a present-tense anchor. The Week 7 submission would not have existed to surface in the hearing. The Week 3 timeline would have been an assertion rather than a provable sequence." She paused. "What you did was technically impeccable and emotionally extraordinary, and I want you to hear that from someone whose professional opinion you can verify." Emily looked at her. This was the most personal thing Torres had said to her across the entire 14 weeks. The most personal thing Torres had probably said to anyone in a professional context in a long time, given the particular careful way she held the line between professional and personal as a matter of practice and principle. "Thank you, Sergeant Torres," she said. "Don't thank me," Torres said. "Do something with it." She walked back toward the cadre building. Emily stood at the edge of the PT field with the finding in her hand and the sun on her face and the sound of 390 recruits training behind her, and she felt the weight of 14 weeks settle and shift, not disappear, but change its nature. The way weight does when you have carried it long enough and far enough that it becomes part of your body rather than a burden on it. She thought about Michael. She thought about him the way she always thought about him when something real happened. Not with grief, which was always there and was not the point, but with the specific desire to tell him about it. To sit on the back porch in Clarksville and say, "Something happened today, and I think you would have understood it." She thought about the word he had given her. Steady. Not hard. Not loud. Not the strongest person in the room. Steady. The thing that actually kept people alive. She folded the finding once and put it in her breast pocket, next to the notebook, next to Michael's photograph. Then she turned back toward the formation. There was still training to do. There was still the rest of the day and the day after that, and the work of becoming the soldier she had come here to become. The finding was not the end of anything. It was the moment the ground stabilized enough to build on. She walked back into the formation. Jason looked at her from the next position over. She gave him one small nod. He closed his eyes for a single second, the way you close your eyes when something you have been holding in your chest finally releases. Then he opened them and faced forward. So did she. The training continued, around them in the barracks and the administrative offices and the formal channels of an institution, beginning the slow and difficult and necessary work of accounting for itself. 390 people were discovering something that none of them would fully articulate until much later. The thing Emily Carter had understood since the morning her brother sat with her on a back porch in Clarksville and told her the truth about what strength actually was. It was not the ability to break people. It was the refusal to be broken. And it was the knowledge carried quietly and held tightly and never confused with loudness or performance that those two things were not the same. The formation that assembled on the first Monday morning after the finding was the same 390 people, the same field, the same summer heat pressing down on all of them, the way it had been pressing down since June. But something was different, not in the physical arrangement of it, not in the uniforms or the ranks or the formal structure that the Army used to organize human beings into something larger than themselves. What was different was the quality of attention inside the formation, the way the recruits stood, the particular alertness of people who had been through something together and knew they had been through something together and had not yet found the words for what that meant. Emily stood in her position. Sergeant First Class Torres stood at the front. Torres did not make a speech about what had happened. She did not reference the investigation, the finding, the hearing, or any of the events of the past 3 weeks. She called the formation to attention in the same precise professional tone she brought to everything, and she gave the day's training instructions, and she dismissed the formation to its first scheduled activity. That was it. That was exactly right, Emily understood. Because the work was the point. Because the institution was not supposed to pause to congratulate itself for doing what it should have been doing all along. She moved with her cohort toward the morning's first activity, and she thought about what Torres had said to her on the PT field on Friday. Do something with it. She had been thinking about those 4 words for 3 days. 2 weeks after the finding, Emily received a letter. It was not official correspondence. It had no institutional letterhead. It arrived in a plain envelope with a Georgia return address and handwriting that was neat and slightly careful in the way of someone who did not write many letters and was aware of it. She opened it at her bunk after lights out with a flashlight held in the crook of her shoulder the way she had learned to read in the field. It was from Andre Coleman. He wrote the way he talked, direct, economical, without extra weight on any word that did not need it. He said he had heard about the formal finding and the scope of what had followed. He said he had been contacted by 2 other veterans from the Fort Bragg period who had seen his name connected to the inquiry and had reached out to submit their own accounts. He said the inquiry into the 2011 to 2013 command period was now formally open, and that Colonel Hargrove had been placed on administrative review pending its outcome. He said he had not expected any of that to be possible. Then he said something she read twice and would carry for a long time afterward. I spent 7 years telling myself that speaking up back then wouldn't have changed anything. That the institution was too big, and he was too protected, and I was too small. I think I was telling myself that story because the alternative that it could have changed something, and I chose not to try, was harder to live with. You made me understand that the story I was telling myself was a choice, not a fact. I'm grateful for that. More than I know how to say in a letter. Emily folded the letter carefully. She put it in the notebook behind the last entry. She lay down and looked at the bunk above her in the dark, and thought about the particular calculus of accountability, the way it moved through time, backward and forward simultaneously. The way one person standing up created a gravity that pulled toward it other people who had been waiting for something solid to stand next to. She had not known about Coleman when she started writing in her notebook in week 2. She had not known about the Fort Bragg period, or the veterans who would come forward, or the formal inquiry that would now extend the reckoning backward 12 years. She had known only what was in front of her. 1 formation, 1 drill sergeant, 1 recruit's careful attention to the difference between discipline and humiliation. The rest of it had grown from that, the way things grow when you give them the right conditions, not designed in advance, not planned from the outcome backward, but built forward from the smallest true thing you had. Her father had told her once late at night in the amber light of his study, "Justice isn't a destination, baby. It's a direction. You keep walking in it, and the landscape changes around you. And eventually you look back and realize you're somewhere that didn't exist when you started." She had not fully understood what he meant until now. The twist she had not seen coming arrived on a Tuesday, 31 days after the finding. It arrived in the form of Brigadier General Sandra Kwan. Not a letter, not a formal communication, not a scheduled meeting. Kwan appeared at Fort Campbell in person, which was not part of any procedure Emily was aware of, and requested a direct meeting with Private Emily Carter. Torres delivered the request herself. Emily looked at her. "A brigadier general wants to meet with me." "Yes, directly, not through the chain." She was very specific about that. Emily thought about what that specificity meant. A brigadier general, circumventing the standard chain to meet directly with an enlisted recruit, was not a normal institutional behavior. It meant Kwan had something to communicate that she did not want filtered or interpreted by the layers of authority between her rank and Emily's. That could mean any number of things. She had learned over the past months to sit with uncertainty without letting it collapse into either hope or dread. "When?" she said. Now, Torres said. The meeting was in the installation commander's conference room, which was empty except for Quan and a female captain, whom Emily did not recognize, and who sat to Quan's left with a legal pad, and wrote nothing on it during the entire meeting. Quan stood when Emily entered, which was not something generals did for privates, and which told Emily immediately that whatever framework she had brought into this room, she needed to let go of it. Private Carter, Quan said. "Sit down, please." Emily sat. Quan sat across from her. For a moment, the general simply looked at her, not appraisingly, not with the evaluative intensity of the hearing room, but with the direct, unhurried attention of someone who has made up her mind about something and is now simply being present with the person the decision concerns. "I want to tell you something," Quan said. "Not as a matter of record, not through official communication, personally." Emily waited. "I have been in this army for 31 years, Quan said. "I have sat on IG panels. I have conducted command climate investigations. I have reviewed formal complaints from enlisted soldiers at every level of the institutional hierarchy." She paused. "In 31 years, I have never seen a junior enlisted recruit produce the quality and depth of documentation that you produced. Not because the circumstances required it, because you understood from the beginning that the truth needs to be built before it can be believed." Emily held that. "The Army is going to try to do something with you," Quan said. "I want you to be aware of that. There are people at levels above this installation who are watching what happened here and drawing conclusions about what you represent. Some of those people will want to manage you. Some of them will want to use you in ways that serve the institution's interests rather than yours. Some of them will offer you things that feel like recognition but are actually containment." Emily looked at her steadily. "What do you think I should do?" she asked. Quan almost smiled. It was a small thing, the corner of her mouth moving a fraction, but it was real. "I think you should decide what you came here to do," she said. "And then, I think you should do that regardless of what the institution offers you in exchange for doing something different." She paused. "You came here because of your brother." Emily went very still. "Yes," she said. "I read the full case file," Kiwan said. "Michael Carter, Army Ranger, 3rd Deployment." She paused and her voice held something in it that was not professional distance, something older and quieter and more human than that. "He was a good soldier from everything in the record." "He was," Emily said. Her voice was level, barely. "What did you come here to continue?" The question sat in the room with the weight of something that had been waiting to be asked directly for a very long time. Emily thought about the back porch in Clarksville, about Michael's grin in the photograph, and the word he had given her, and the thing he had said about protecting the people beside you. "He believed the institution was worth fighting for," she said. "Not by being hard, by being steady, by helping the people beside you become stronger." She paused. "I came here to do that. Whatever it looks like." Quan looked at her for a long moment. "Then do that," she said simply. "The institution will push back. It will offer you shortcuts and complicate your path, and sometimes it will try to break you exactly the way Whitaker tried to break you, and with better tools. And you will do what you did here." She leaned forward slightly. "Because you already know how." Emily breathed. "General Quan," she said. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Why are you here in person? Why not a letter or a formal commendation through channels?" Quan was quiet for a moment. "Because letters go into files," she said. "And I wanted to look at you directly and say this to your face." She paused. "And because 31 years ago I was a young woman in a formation where something happened that should not have happened, and nobody was doing what you did. Nobody had built the record. And the thing that happened went unaddressed, and it cost people I cared about more than I can tell you." Her voice was even. "I wanted to meet the person who built the record. I wanted to do that in person." The room was very quiet. Emily did not try to fill the quiet. Then Quan stood. Emily stood. They looked at each other across the table, a brigadier general with 31 years and a private with 14 weeks, and the particular irreducible bond of people who have understood the same truth from different distances. Quan extended her hand. Emily shook it. She found Jason and Rachel and Derek and the others in the common area of the barracks that evening. She did not tell them about the meeting with Quan. Not because it was classified or confidential, but because it was personal in a way that did not translate easily into a group conversation, in a way that belonged to her, the way Michael's photograph belonged to her fully privately, as something that lived in her chest, rather than in shared space. What she told them was simpler. She told them that the Fort Bragg inquiry was open, and that Coleman had heard from 2 other veterans who were now formally part of the record. She told them that Hargrove was under administrative review. She told them that the installation commander had ordered a formal review of every evaluation produced under Whitaker's supervision during the current training cycle. She watched their faces as the information landed. Derek leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. It was the gesture he made when something hit him, somewhere larger than he expected, and he needed a moment before he could respond to it at a normal scale. Coleman's people came forward, he said. 2 of them, Emily said, voluntarily. Because they saw what happened here, Jason said. It was not a question. Yes. Jason looked at his hands. He turned them over in his lap, the same gesture she had seen from Coleman on the video call. The gesture of a man taking stock of what his hands had done and what they might still do. You know what I keep thinking about, he said. Nobody answered. They waited. I keep thinking about the day I came back from that session with Whitaker, he said. When I sat on the bunk and didn't say anything for 20 minutes, and you sat down next to me. He looked at Emily. You didn't push. You just sat there. And then you asked me one question, and the question was so specific and so careful that I understood even then, before I understood anything about what you were building, I understood that you were someone who was paying real attention. He paused. I was going to request a transfer, he said. That night, I had already decided. I was going to put in the paperwork in the morning. He paused again. I didn't because you asked me that question, and I wanted to see what came next. Emily looked at him. What question? Rachel said. She asked me if anyone else heard it, Jason said. What Whitaker said to me. She asked me if anyone else heard it. He looked at Emily. That was the whole question, and I said no, just me and him, and she nodded and wrote something down. The common area was quiet for a moment. That question told me something, he said. It told me you were thinking about evidence, not emotion, that you already understood that what he did needed to survive outside the moment it happened in, if it was ever going to mean anything. He shook his head slowly. I had never thought about it that way. I was just hurt and angry and ready to leave, and you were already 3 steps ahead of where I was. Emily looked at him for a long moment. I wasn't 3 steps ahead, she said. I was doing what my father taught me. It's not the same thing as knowing where it was going to end up. Where did your father think it would end up? Derek asked. She thought about that. He never told me to expect a specific outcome, she said. He told me to build the record. He said the record does its work in ways you can't predict or control, and your job is to make it as true and as complete as you can, and then to let it do what it does. She paused. He said the truth has its own momentum. Your job is to give it something to stand on. Webb, who had been quiet through most of the conversation, carrying his weight with the specific economy of a man who had spent everything he had just getting to the point of being in this room, spoke for the first time. My father called me again, he said. Everyone looked at him. He said he heard about the finding. A pause. He said he was proud of me. The way he said it was careful, precise. The voice of someone delivering a piece of information that had moved through him slowly and taken a long time to reach the surface. He said, and I want to get this exactly right because it matters, he said, I taught you to trust the institution. I should have taught you that trusting it means holding it to the standard it claims to hold itself to. Those are not the same thing, and I got them confused for a long time. Nobody spoke for a moment. That's a hard thing for a man like your father to say, Rachel said quietly. Yeah, Webb said. It was. The graduation ceremony for their training cohort was scheduled for a Friday at the end of August. Emily did not know until 48 hours before it happened that anything about the ceremony would be different from the standard format. She found out from Torres, who appeared at the barracks Wednesday evening, and told her to report to the installation commander's office the following morning in dress uniform. She reported. The installation commander was a colonel named Walsh, a compact, serious man who had spent 22 years moving through the army with the careful, methodical attention of someone who understood that every decision he made was a data point in a pattern that would define him over time. He had accepted the panel's finding without institutional resistance, which Emily understood now from everything Quan had told her was not as simple as it might appear, which meant Walsh was a man who had weighed the institutional pressure against the institutional obligation and had chosen the obligation. That told her who he was. He told her that the Army was commending her formal conduct throughout the investigation, with a specific citation for her documentation methodology and her sustained use of proper institutional channels under sustained pressure. He told her the citation would be read at the graduation ceremony. He told her that she had been recommended for accelerated consideration for officer candidate school based on her performance record across the training cycle and the documented evidence of the leadership qualities she had demonstrated. He told her these things in a measured professional tone that was clearly designed to communicate respect, without overclaiming what the institution was doing or implying that one citation and one recommendation made the full accounting complete. She appreciated the precision of that. "Colonel Walsh," she said, "I want to ask something." "Ask." The other recruits in this cohort, who experienced conduct issues under Sergeant Whitaker's supervision, the ones who didn't come forward formally, whose situations are now part of the broader evaluation review, I want to make sure their records are being assessed individually. That nobody falls through the cracks of the institutional process because their situation was less documented than mine. Walsh looked at her. "That concern is already being addressed," he said. "The IG office has conducted individual reviews with every recruit in the cohort. Every evaluation under Whitaker's supervision is being independently verified. Every recruit knows they can request that review. They've been formally notified." Emily nodded. "Thank you, Colonel." Walsh looked at her for a moment, with the expression she was coming to recognize in senior officers who had been watching what had unfolded here. Something between professional assessment and something harder to categorize. Something that had to do with encountering a quality they had not expected in the specific form it had taken. "Private Carter," he said, "the Army is a large institution with a complicated history and an imperfect record on a number of matters. What you did here did not fix all of that. I want to be honest with you about that." "I know," she said. "What you did was add one documented, formally adjudicated, publicly acknowledged data point to the record. One case where the process worked because someone made it work." He paused. "That matters more than you might think. Not because it solves everything. Because it becomes part of what the institution can point to when it tries to explain what it is supposed to be." Emily thought about her father walking into courtrooms for 30 years and fighting in a language the institution could actually hear. One case at a time. One documented truth at a time. "I understand that," she said. The graduation ceremony was everything. Those events are formal and structured and carrying the particular solemnity of a ritual designed to mark the crossing of a threshold. 390 recruits standing in formation, their families in the bleachers, the American flag at the front of the field, the machinery of tradition, doing what tradition does when it is operating at its best, reminding the people inside it what they are part of and why that matters. Emily's parents were in the fourth row. She had not seen them since June. Her mother was holding a small flag, the kind they gave out at the entrance, and her expression was the particular expression of a mother who has been frightened for a long time and is now sitting in a space where the fear is converting slowly and with effort into something that can coexist with pride. Her father sat beside her mother with his hands folded in his lap and his back straight and his face composed in the precise, controlled way she had always recognized as the external expression of interior emotion. He was managing very carefully. 30 years in courtrooms, fighting for things that mattered in a voice the institution could hear. He had taught her everything she had used. When Colonel Walsh read the citation, her father's hands unfolded from his lap and pressed flat against his thighs, and he did not look at the field. He looked at his hands. the gesture of a man absorbing something he has been working toward for 30 years through his children, and has just heard described formally and publicly in the specific language of the institution that the work was always aimed at. Her mother reached over and covered his hand with hers. Emily, standing in formation, could not see any of that from where she was. But she felt it. The way you feel the people who built you, even across a distance. After the formal ceremony in the open time, before the families dispersed, she found her parents at the edge of the field. Her father held her for a long moment without speaking. When he stepped back, his eyes were bright in a way she had seen only a few times in her life. Not weakness. Nothing like weakness, but the specific brightness of a man who has spent decades building something and has just seen it walk back to him on its own. "Baby," he said. "Dad?" "You did exactly right," he said. "Every step. I did what you taught me." He shook his head. "No," he said. "I taught you the method. You found the courage to use it when it cost you something real to use it. That part was yours." She thought about 14 weeks of waking up each morning and choosing the careful, documented, patient route when every instinct in her wanted to do something faster and louder and less controlled. "It cost something," she said. "Every day." "The things worth doing always do," he said. Her mother stepped in between them and held Emily's face in both hands, the way she had since Emily was small, just for a moment, just to make the contact real. "Michael would be so proud," she said. Emily closed her eyes. "I know." "No," she said. "I know he would." That evening, after the families had gone and the formal events had closed and the barracks had settled into the particular quiet of a day that had been too full to process all at once, Emily sat on the edge of her bunk and held her notebook in her hands. She opened it to the first entry. Week 2, the first incident. Jason's face, the floor of the barracks, the precise and careful question she had asked because her father's voice had been in her head, and she had understood even then that what she was watching was the beginning of something that needed to be documented before it could be changed. She turned through the pages slowly. 14 weeks of dates and times and exact words. A record built for a truth that needed to survive without emotion. She had not known on the night she wrote the first entry how far the record would travel. She had not known about Coleman, or the Fort Bragg period, or Brigadier General Kwan, or the formal citations, or any of the things that the documentation had made possible. She had known only what was in front of her. The specific present manageable truth of one formation and one drill sergeant and one recruit who understood the difference between discipline and humiliation and had decided that the difference was worth writing down. She closed the notebook. She held it for a moment, the weight of it, the accumulated weight of everything it contained and everything that had grown from it. Then she set it on the shelf beside Michael's photograph. Both of them there side by side, the record and the reason. She heard footsteps in the hallway, and Jason appeared in the doorway. "You okay?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I really am." He looked at her for a moment. "What happens next?" he asked. "For you. What do you actually want?" She thought about that honestly, not the institutional answer, not the strategic answer, but the one that came from the same place the notebook had come from. The place where the real reasons lived. "I want to stay," she said. "I want to train people. I want to be the person in the formation who recruits can come to when something is wrong. I want to build the kind of environment where the documentation doesn't have to be secret because the standard is actually enforced." She paused. "I want to be the person my brother described, the one who makes the people beside them stronger." Jason was quiet for a moment. "You're already that person," he said simply. She looked at him. "You've been that person since week 2, he said. "You just needed the institution to catch up." She did not have an answer for that. She just held it the way you hold the things that people say to you when they see you clearly and mean what they say. After he left, she sat in the quiet for a long time. She thought about Whitaker, about the formal proceedings that were continuing, about the man he had once been and the man he had become, and the long, slow, invisible process by which unchecked authority erodes the capacity for honest self-assessment. She did not feel satisfaction about his fall. She felt something more complicated, the specific weight of understanding that accountability is not revenge, that what she had built was not a weapon, but a mirror, and that what the mirror showed was something the institution needed to see, regardless of how uncomfortable the seeing was. She thought about Quan, 31 years, in still fighting for the institution to be what it claimed to be. She thought about Coleman, who had carried 7 years of a story he had told himself to avoid the harder truth, and who had put down that story and picked up something real. She thought about Webb, whose father had called to say he had gotten two things confused for a long time. She thought about Derek Okafor's sister, who wanted to enlist next year. And she thought about what it meant, what it actually specifically practically meant, to make sure that when that young woman walked into her first formation, she walked into something that was trying to become worthy of her. That was the work. Not the citation. Not the OCS recommendation. Not the formal finding, or the institutional commendation, or the record that would outlast this posting and follow her forward into whatever came next. The work was the daily, unglamorous, patient, steady commitment to being the kind of person who sees what is happening clearly and names it accurately and builds the record and holds the line and does not let fear or pressure or institutional gravity determine the shape of what is possible. The work was being steady the way Michael had said. Not hard. Steady. She reached up and touched his photograph lightly with her fingertips. Then she lay down, and she looked at the bunk above her, and she let herself rest in the knowledge of what had been done and what remained to be done. And she understood with the clear, unambiguous certainty of someone who has found the ground beneath them exactly who she was and what she was here to do. 390 soldiers had watched one young recruit refuse to disappear, and because she had refused, because she had stood in that field with a hand at her collar and said quietly and without flinching that everyone was watching, the institution had been made to look at itself. That was not the end of anything. That was how real change has always begun. One person, one truth, one record at a time, built carefully and held steady, and offered to an institution that needed it whether or not it knew how to ask. Emily Carter had come to Fort Campbell to continue what her brother believed. She had done that. She was still doing it. And she would not stop.